Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Mom looked right at me and said it with that little tilt in her voice she always used when she wanted to sound like she was joking but wasn't. "We didn't get you anything for your birthday. You're always off traveling somewhere anyway." And she smiled. That tight little smile that never touched her eyes. The kind of smile that came wrapped in sarcasm and always felt like it came with a slap you were supposed to thank her for. I laughed, I think. Or maybe I just exhaled through my nose in that way people do when they don't want to start something at the dinner table. Either way, the silence after was longer than it should have been. Dad just sat there, carving up a pork roast like it owed him money. He never really said much, especially not to me. Hasn't in years. He looked up for a second, nodded at the roast like he was proud of it, and then went back to slicing. The knife made the sticky, sawing sound that filled the space between us. The smell was good. I'll give him that, rosemary and garlic, just like Mom used to make on Sundays when we were kids. I don't think they even realized it was the exact same meal we always had when something serious was about to go down. I hadn't been back here in maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. Before that, it was even longer. Not because I didn't care, despite what they always hinted at. There was never anything for me here. Not really. This house never felt like home. Not even when I was a kid. I remember standing in the hallway when I was 10, listening to them fight over money while my older brother Ryan got grounded for sneaking out and I got grounded for not telling on him. That was the dynamic. Ryan lit the fires. I carried the blame. And now here we were. Me at 41, sitting across from two people who hadn't remembered how I like my coffee since Bush was president. And not the son. The old man. They still offered me skim milk even though I can't stand it. They didn't ask about my work or the new contract in Germany or the award I got last month in Atlanta. They didn't ask about anything. Just mentioned the weather and the new neighbors down the street and how they finally replaced the blinds in the guest room, which was apparently my room again, even though it's full of exercise equipment and the closet smells like mothballs and old resentment. And here's the kicker, they didn't forget my birthday. That would have been easier, honestly. No, they remembered. They just didn't bother. Said I was always gone so they didn't know what to get me. Like presence cancels out thoughtfulness. Like my life being in motion gave them a free pass to stand still. What they don't know is I've been planning this visit for months. Ever since I found out from an old family friend, someone who actually still answers my calls, that the bank had come sniffing around. Seems like Dad hadn't paid the mortgage in a while. They'd refinanced to help Ryan after his 3rd divorce and 2nd DUI. They never asked me. Never told me. Just assumed I'd be too busy or too far to care. But I did. I always did. So yeah, I bought the house. Quietly. Paid off the debt. Signed the deed over to a trust under my name. They're technically tenants now, though they don't know it yet. I wasn't gonna say anything, was gonna let it sit there, like a safety net they didn't know was holding them up. But then Mom had to open her mouth and dig that little emotional dagger in just deep enough to twist. I looked around the room, taking it all in. The wallpaper was new, but the furniture was still the same. Floral print couches, those dusty curtains with the plastic rods, and the old grandfather clock that never told the right time. It was like walking into a version of the past that refused to change, even while everything else did. Ryan wasn't there, of course. Said he couldn't make it because of court stuff. No one elaborated. No one asked. His seat at the table was empty, but his presence hovered like cigarette smoke, faint, but impossible to ignore. I used to envy him, you know? He had their attention, their affection, their forgiveness. He could mess up and still get a hug. I got A's and got told, don't brag. I pushed my fork around the plate for a bit, not really hungry. Not for food, anyway. I was hungry for something else. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or just the basic decency of someone looking me in the eyes and saying, "We're proud of you." I've heard those words from strangers, from coworkers, from airport bartenders. Never from them. So when Mom hit me with that line, "You're always off traveling somewhere anyway," I felt something crack. Not loud, not violent, just final, like a door closing with a soft click. I reached into my bag, ran my fingers across the envelope I'd brought with me. Thick paper, legal edges. A gift to myself, technically. But maybe, just maybe, a message to them. I didn't open it. Not yet. Not while the roast was still steaming and the small talk hadn't dried up. But I knew I would. Tonight. And when I did, they'd hear it not in volume, but in silence. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say to people who've never really heard you is nothing at all. The silence after Mom's birthday comment didn't settle. It festered, like something left out too long on the counter, growing mold while everyone pretended not to notice the smell. Dad was still busy with the roast, careful slices like he was dissecting something instead of serving dinner, and Mom began asking about the weather in Frankfurt, because apparently that's safer than asking about my life. I told her I hadn't been to Frankfurt in 6 months, which she clearly didn't remember, and she just nodded like she hadn't heard me say anything at all. That's always been her way: absorb what fits the narrative, discard the rest like junk mail. I looked across the table, the linen napkins folded into triangles the way she always did, like we were hosting dignitaries and not sitting in a house whose mortgage I now owned. The plates were her good china, the kind with the blue trim and the hairline crack in the corner of mine, the same one I had growing up. She still gave me that plate, like it was a reminder of who I was supposed to be in this house, the one who made do with the cracked version, who didn't complain because someone else needed more. They never said outright that Ryan was the favorite. They never had to. It was baked into everything, in the way Dad lit up when Ryan walked in a room, or how Mom used to pack his lunch in that insulated NFL bag while I got a paper sack that tore before noon. I still remember the Christmas I was 12. Ryan had been going on about this red Schwinn bike for weeks, and I remember watching Dad load it out of the truck like it was the Holy Grail, wheeling it right into the living room with a big red bow that looked like a car commercial. When it came time for me to open my present, I peeled back the wrapping paper and found a hardback book titled Responsibility Builds Character. I sat there holding it like someone handed me a fucking mirror when I asked for a window. They smiled, patted my shoulder, and said, "We knew you'd appreciate something meaningful." Ryan was already halfway down the block by then, tires spinning like freedom, and I just nodded and said thank you, like I'd been taught. Back at the table now, years later, I glanced at the empty chair where Ryan should have been, and the memory landed like a stone in my chest. Mom poured more wine without asking. She never remembered I stopped drinking reds because of the migraines. She never remembered a lot of things, but she always remembered to remind me that I'd missed Christmas last year and Thanksgiving the year before, as if presence was a currency and my balance was perpetually in the red. "So, how's the company?" she asked, without looking at me, eyes on the roast like she was hoping it would answer for me. I told her we'd expanded, picked up contracts in the EU, maybe looking at Singapore next year. Her only reply was, "That's nice," like I'd told her I found a new brand of toothpaste. No follow-up, no curiosity, just a nod and a mouthful of potatoes. Dad grunted something that might have been approval or indigestion. It was always hard to tell with him, and then started talking about how the neighbor's kid just got a job in computers, making good money. That's when I realized they didn't just forget the details, they had no idea who I was anymore. Maybe they never did. Maybe they only knew the version of me they'd edited into existence. The quiet one, the reliable one, the one who left so they could tell everyone how successful I'd become without having to actually ask what I did. It wasn't about knowing me. It was about the idea of me they could use at barbecues. Have you ever sat at a dinner table with people who raised you and felt like you were a stranger with a secret they couldn't handle? What would you do if they gave you nothing and you held everything? I looked at Mom, really looked at her, the way you study a painting you've seen 100 times and suddenly notice the crack in the brushwork. She was thinner than I remembered, hair more gray than blonde now, and her hands, always so busy, twitched with some nervous energy I couldn't place. Dad had aged too, though he tried to hide it under the same crew cut and old man tan. But it was there. In the way he struggled to carve the meat. In the way his shirt didn't quite fit right. And for a second, just one, I felt a flicker of guilt, like maybe I'd waited too long to come back. Maybe I should have checked in more. Called more. Maybe I was partly to blame. Then Mom said, Ryan wanted to come, but you know how court stuff is, and the guilt vanished like smoke and wind. I didn't even ask what court stuff meant. I knew better. Asking would open the door to one of her tangents about how he's trying his best, and he's had a rough time, as if Ryan's adulthood was one long storm and I was the umbrella that left him behind. Instead, I nodded and chewed my pork roast in silence, wondering how the hell you can be someone's child and still feel like you're trespassing in their lives. That's when I touched the envelope in my pocket. It was still there, crisp, full of quiet power. I wasn't planning to bring it out yet, but I swear I could feel it pulsing through the fabric, like it knew its time was coming. They kept asking questions without really asking, like they wanted to skim across the surface of me without diving in. I gave them the answers they wanted, vague, easy, bloodless. Because the truth? The real truth? Would have shattered something fragile neither of them even admitted was cracking. And still, I waited. Because this wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about proving a point. This was about something colder. Something older. This was about finally saying, without saying, I saw everything. I remember. And I never forgot. The last bite of roast stuck in my throat like drywall dust, dry and tasteless, and the gravy had already begun to form a cold skin across the plate, curling at the edges the way old memories do when they've overstayed their welcome. Nobody had touched the pie Mom brought out, a store-bought lemon meringue with a plastic lid still sitting under the pie plate, as if she wanted to remind me she didn't bake anymore or maybe never did. Dad had pushed his chair back, glass of tap water in his hand, staring somewhere past me, and Mom had her elbows on the table now, chin resting on her palm, pretending to listen while I answered more of her disinterested questions about travel, hotels, and whether Singapore still has that gun law. I watched them both carefully. I watched the way Mom scratched at the seam on the tablecloth with her thumbnail. I watched the way Dad cleared his throat and didn't say anything after. I watched the way they didn't look at each other anymore unless they needed something past, like whatever connection they used to have had worn out, threadbare and patched one too many times. I watched all of it, took it in like a performance I'd seen before and wasn't sure I'd paid for. And then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, the envelope sliding out smooth as silk and cool as winter. It was thicker than it needed to be, not because the papers inside were many, but because the truth tends to feel heavier when you finally decide to pull it out into the light. I held it in my hand for a moment, letting it sit there like a fragile animal, calm for now, but ready to bite if mishandled. They weren't paying attention yet. That was fine. I wanted the moment to find its own rhythm. I wanted the room to go still before I lit the match. I laid the envelope on the table slowly, purposefully, right next to the plate with the untouched pie. Dad glanced at it, then at me, and raised one eyebrow in a way that said he wasn't going to ask, but he wanted me to know he noticed. Mom blinked at it and gave this short, soft laugh, the kind people give when they're trying to make light of something that already feels too heavy. "What's that, your tax refund?" she said, with a smirk that didn't land, and a tone that slid off me like rain off wax. I didn't answer. I just picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, let the pause stretch out wide and long like a hallway in a bad dream. Then I said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just casually, almost like an afterthought, as if it had just occurred to me now. "Guess you'll want this back eventually." I watched it land. Not the envelope, but the sentence. The words hit the air and hung there like gun smoke, curling invisible around the chandelier that buzzed faintly with the wrong kind of light bulb. Mom's smirk faded fast, replaced by confusion first, then calculation. Dad put his water down, a small clink against the coaster that might as well have been a gavel in a courtroom. Their eyes locked onto the envelope now, like it had started glowing. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, voice thinner now, the way it got when she was about to be caught in a truth she didn't want to own. Dad stayed silent, but I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch just once, but enough. I leaned back in my chair, legs stretched under the table, and said nothing for a moment longer than necessary. The silence did more than any speech I could have prepared. Then I reached forward, opened the envelope, and slowly slid the papers out across the table, letting them fan out like a hand of cards in a poker game that no one realized they were playing. Title deed, transaction receipt, lien release, my name, their address, the bank seal. The house was mine. Mom's face went pale, not like ghost pale, but sick pale, like the kind you get when you realize you've forgotten something important and there's no way to fix it. Dad didn't say a word, just looked at the papers like they were written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. I paid off the mortgage, I said, still calm, still sitting back like this was any other night. Months ago. You were about to lose the house. The bank had started proceedings. I took care of it. Mom looked at me like I'd slapped her with an apology. Why? Why didn't you tell us? And there it was. That question. Not, thank you. Not, we're sorry. Just, why didn't you tell us? Like the sin wasn't their silence or the way they let the house rot under the weight of bad decisions, but mine, for handling it without their permission. I wanted to, I said honestly. But then I remembered how you talked about me. How you talked to me. And I figured, maybe the gift would land better if it came with a little reminder. Dad finally spoke, his voice like gravel and smoke. So what, you're a landlord now? I didn't answer that. I just looked at him, not angry, not smug, just tired. Tired of being the one who cleaned up after the mess. Tired of being the one who swallowed it all and smiled anyway. Tired of holding back what needed to be said just to keep the peace in a house that never had any. I'm not asking for rent, I said, pushing the envelope toward the center of the table. I'm just saying. Now you know. The room went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Not even angry quiet. Just still. Like the kind of stillness right after a snowstorm, when everything is covered and you're not sure what's broken underneath yet. Mom looked like she was trying to find the right words, but kept grabbing the wrong ones. Dad looked at his water like he was trying to remember why he ever poured it. And me? I just sat there, sipping wine, wondering how long it would take them to speak again. Wondering if they'd even try. Wondering what it said about us that I had to buy their silence just to finally have mine heard. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to get, the kind that comes in the middle of a Tuesday when you're standing in an airport lounge pretending to care about the weather in Berlin. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, and I almost let it go to voicemail because I assumed it was another contractor trying to push a timeline I already knew we wouldn't hit. But something made me answer, maybe instinct, maybe boredom, maybe just that quiet itch behind the ears that tells you something's off. The voice on the other end was familiar but faded, like an old tape left too long in the sun. It was Mrs. Kolchak, our next-door neighbor from when I was a kid. The woman who used to babysit Ryan and me when Mom had a bridge club or needed to pretend she still had friends. She didn't waste time on small talk. Said she saw a notice taped to the front door of the house, and she didn't want to meddle, but she figured someone should know. I asked what kind of notice, and she got quiet, then said, bank stuff, foreclosure probably. Third one I've seen this month around the neighborhood. My stomach dropped, not because I didn't believe her, but because I did, immediately, without hesitation. I thanked her, hung up, and stood there holding the phone like it had just burned a hole through my hand. They hadn't told me anything. Not a single word. No call. No email. No desperate message laced with guilt and obligation. Just silence. The same silence they'd weaponized for years, using it to control the narrative, to make me feel like a visitor in my own damn family. They were about to lose the house I grew up in, and they didn't think I should know. I didn't wait. I rerouted my flight. Skipped Berlin entirely. Took a cab straight from the airport to a bank in town that still smelled like printer ink and stale coffee, and walked in wearing the same jacket I'd worn to dinner with a German ambassador 2 nights earlier. The manager recognized my name from the wire transfer a few years back when I'd helped fund one of Ryan's many failed side hustles, something about drop shipping novelty socks. The manager didn't say much, but her eyes said plenty, especially when she saw the address on the paperwork. Yes, foreclosure proceedings had been initiated. Yes, 3 notices had been sent. Yes, final steps were set to begin next month. The mortgage had been unpaid for nearly 6 months. A second lien had been added 2 years ago, Ryan again, if I had to guess, and the bank had been holding back out of some misguided deference to the family name, or maybe just bureaucratic molasses. But the facts were the facts. The house was slipping through their fingers, and no one had thought to pick up the damn phone. I sat there at that oversized mahogany desk while the manager offered me a cup of coffee and a pamphlet on home equity options, like I was some wide-eyed first-time buyer instead of the son trying to clean up a mess he wasn't even invited to know existed. And while she talked, I did the math in my head, how much I had in liquid, how fast I could move it, whether I wanted to do this out of love or just plain spite. I didn't answer her right away, just nodded and stared at the little plastic pen chained to the desk like it was doing time. I paid off the full debt the next morning. No calls. No conditions. Just a wire transfer and a digital signature. The house was safe. For now. The bank would remove the lien, and the deed would be updated with my name, held in trust through a shell company I'd created years ago for investment properties. That part was easy. The hard part came next, deciding what the hell to do with it. There's something that happens when you realize your parents don't trust you enough to ask for help, even when they're drowning. It's not just hurt. It's betrayal mixed with shame, stirred slowly over time until it curdles into resentment. They didn't think I would care, or maybe they did but assumed I'd throw it back in their faces. Maybe they just didn't want to give me that power, afraid I'd use it to lord something over them, afraid I'd use it the way they use silence and guilt and years of lopsided affection. And maybe, deep down, they still saw me as the kid who got a book about responsibility for Christmas, while Ryan got a bike he immediately wrecked on the sidewalk. I could have told them. Could have shown up at the door with the papers in hand, a triumphant grin and a "you're welcome" curled on my tongue like a knife. But I didn't. I waited. I watched. I planned. Because timing, I've learned, is everything. And the right moment to tell someone you saved their ass is never when they're expecting it. It's when they least deserve it. When they're most convinced they don't need you. That's when it stings. That's when it lands. So I waited. I kept the envelope close, moved through my days like nothing had changed, let the silence sit between us like a sleeping dog I didn't want to wake. I answered their occasional texts with one-liners, deflected their "you never visit" guilt trips with vague promises and travel excuses. I waited for the perfect moment, the one where their indifference would be at its sharpest, their pride swollen just enough to make the fall more noticeable. And then Mom looked me in the eye across that roast dinner and said, "We didn't get you anything. You're always off traveling somewhere anyway." And I knew. That was the moment. The lie dressed as truth. The casual dismissal that opened the door. She thought I was gone, thought I was absent, thought I didn't care. And now? Now I owned the roof over her head. The silence didn't let up. It hung there like wet clothes in a cold room, heavy and sagging, refusing to dry, refusing to move, and still neither of them said anything, not a word, not a whisper, just the ticking of that stupid grandfather clock in the corner. Ticking like it was the only one in the house willing to acknowledge that time had moved forward, while everyone else stayed frozen in place. I stared down at the empty plate in front of me, the pie untouched, the envelope slightly off-center like a chess piece pushed forward in a quiet dare. And in that moment, all I could hear was my own breath and that voice in the back of my head, the one I'd had since I was 10 years old, the one that kicked in when Dad got too loud or Mom went too quiet, the one that said, "Keep your mouth shut, Ethan. Don't start anything. Keep it together. Be the good one." But that voice was tired now, old and hoarse, and it didn't have the strength to stop me from thinking the thoughts I'd buried deep for decades. I remembered the way they used to look at Ryan like he was made of gold, like he was the bright light at the end of the tunnel, and I was the damn flashlight they only pulled out when the power went out. I remembered sitting on the edge of my bed at 12, staring at the wall while Mom cried in the kitchen and Dad slammed another drawer shut, yelling about how they couldn't cover the cost of Ryan's private school after his grades slipped and he got caught with pot in his locker. I remembered being the one who walked into the kitchen, not to ask what was wrong, but to start cleaning up the broken glass on the floor without a word, because I knew it wasn't about me, and still I had to clean it up. They didn't raise me. Not in the way people mean when they say it with warmth in their voice, like a badge of honor or a soft nostalgia. No, they kept me alive, clothed and fed. Sure, but raise me? No. I raised myself. I figured out early that if I wanted to get through school without causing trouble, I had to keep my head down, say yes, sir and no, ma'am, and let Ryan be the loud one, the messy one, the screw-up who always got another chance. When Ryan stole from the gas station and Dad had to talk the manager out of pressing charges, he got grounded for a week and a new phone the next month. When I missed curfew by 15 minutes, after a debate tournament that ran late, I got the silent treatment for 2 weeks and a lecture about discipline and not squandering potential. I learned quickly that being perfect wasn't rewarded, it was expected. The bar was set high for me and buried underground for Ryan, and no one ever stopped to ask why I never smiled in family photos or why my eyes always looked like they were somewhere else entirely. And now here we were. Me, sitting across from the two people who taught me everything I needed to know about conditional love and performative parenting, watching them squirm in the quiet as if silence was suddenly uncomfortable now that they didn't control it. I wanted to laugh, maybe even scream, but all I did was lean forward slightly, press my palms together like I was about to pray, and say, almost softly, if I always had to be the grown-up, then what the hell do I owe you? Mom flinched. Just a little, a twitch around her eyes. Dad didn't move, but I saw his throat shift. He swallowed something bitter, probably his own pride. I didn't ask the question to get an answer. I knew I wouldn't get one. I said it because it needed to be said out loud. Finally, after years of pretending like everything had been fair, like everything had been okay, like I hadn't spent most of my childhood trying not to become the man Dad was, or the boy Ryan still is. They liked to act like I'd left them, like I'd turned my back on the family to chase money and hotels and long flights to countries they couldn't pronounce, but they never once looked in the mirror and asked what I'd been running from. Because the truth? I didn't leave them. They just never gave me a reason to stay. Ryan got away with everything, every lie, every screw-up, every debt, and when he came crawling back, they always found a way to justify it. He's sensitive, Mom would say. He's just lost his way, Dad would add, as if that excused the time he borrowed money from Grandma and never paid her back, or the time he crashed Dad's truck and blamed it on black ice that didn't exist. Meanwhile, I graduated early, got scholarships, landed a job out of college, and paid off their credit card debt without telling them just to avoid the embarrassment of watching them sink again. They didn't say thank you then either. So now, when they looked at me like I was the villain for revealing the truth, when Mom whispered, "You didn't have to do it this way," like I'd embarrassed them somehow, I couldn't help but smile. Not with joy, but with that bitter understanding that comes when you realize you've finally stopped seeking the approval of people who wouldn't know what to do with it even if you handed it to them in a frame. I know, I said, leaning back again. But I did. They still didn't ask why I did it. Still didn't ask why I'd stepped in to save the house, or how I even knew it was in danger, or why I'd kept it quiet. Because to ask would mean acknowledging they needed me. And people like them, people who've built their entire self-image around the idea that they sacrificed everything for their kids, can't admit they ever needed saving from themselves. So I let the silence hang a little longer. And in that space, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in this house in a very, very long time: control. Not revenge. Not victory. Just the calm, cold certainty that I didn't owe them anything they hadn't already taken without asking. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I didn't plan on running into anyone, especially not her, not on a morning like that, when the sun was barely up and the frost still clung to the grass like it had no intention of letting go. I was just out walking, thinking too loud and breathing too hard, trying to clear my head before the day started unraveling again, when I heard someone call my name in that unmistakable cadence only small-town folks use, like they're inviting you into a conversation you didn't agree to join. It was Mrs. Halvorson Lynn, technically, but I hadn't called her that since I was in 8th grade, back when she ran the PDA with an iron clipboard and always smelled like cinnamon gum and baby powder. She looked exactly the same, maybe a little more silver in her short, perfectly curled hair, but still with those sharp eyes that could slice you open or warm you up, depending on what side of her you landed on. She had a mug in one hand and a tiny dog in the other, and she waved me over with that look people give you when they've been dying to talk but needed you to make the first move. I thought about pretending I didn't hear her, but there was no escape once she made eye contact. Small towns don't do polite avoidance. "You're back," she said, as I stepped closer to her driveway, where a plastic pumpkin still sat on the porch in January like someone had forgotten time kept moving. "Didn't think we'd see you again. You look taller." I laughed at that because I hadn't grown in 20 years, but she said it the way people do when they don't know how to say, "You seem different now, maybe a little more broken in." I told her I was just in town for a short visit, downplaying everything like I always did when someone tried to peek past the surface. But she wasn't buying it, not for a second. She stared at me like I was a page in a book she'd already read, waiting to see if the ending had changed. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, about the weather and the sidewalk cracks, and how the city never fixed the pothole near Elm Street. I asked about her daughter, the one I used to carpool with, and she said she'd moved out west, divorced twice, but finally happy. Then she asked how my folks were doing, and I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "They told everyone you were too busy to visit," she said, after a pause that carried more weight than the question itself. "Said you were traveling the world, too important to come home for the little things. But your mom," she always had that look when she said it, like she was trying to make it sound like a compliment, but couldn't quite sell it. I didn't say anything at first, because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. Lynn looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly, like she was searching for the right place to dig in without drawing blood. Then she continued, slow and careful, like she was unwrapping something fragile. "They always talked about you, Ethan. Always said how smart you were, how proud they were. They bragged about your job, your promotions, your travels. Your dad even told the butcher once that you'd met a prince somewhere in Europe. They said you were too busy for holidays, but they never said you weren't welcome." Not out loud. That stopped me cold, not because it changed anything exactly, but because it cracked open a part of the story I hadn't been ready to question. I'd always told myself they didn't want me around, that they'd made it hard for me to come home, like they'd built emotional barbed wire around the front porch and dared me to climb over. But hearing that from someone who'd seen them in the grocery store and at church and in those slow-moving neighborhood potlucks, it made me wonder. Had they really pushed me away? Or had they just never figured out how to ask me to come back? I told her I hadn't heard much of that growing up, that most of what I remembered was being the one who got left out of decisions and lectured about responsibility while Ryan was forgiven before he even apologized. She nodded like that made sense, but then said something I wasn't expecting. "Your mom used to cry at the 4th of July picnic after the fireworks. Always after the fireworks. Said she wished she heard from you more. Said she missed her boy. Of course, she never said it to your face. Some people just don't know how." I didn't know what to do with that. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to nostalgia and polite small-town storytelling. But Lynn wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. She never had been. And hearing that from her made the quiet inside me shift just a little. Not enough to undo everything, not enough to change the past, but enough to muddy the water, to make it harder to see the edges I'd drawn so clearly around their faults. I thanked her, eventually, and told her it was good to see a familiar face. She smiled and said I should stop by again before I left, said the neighborhood missed me. I walked away slowly, the frost still crunching under my boots, and I realized that something about what she'd said was going to follow me long after I got back on the plane. Because maybe they had talked about me with pride. Maybe they had missed me, even if they didn't know how to say it in the ways that counted. Maybe their silence wasn't always a weapon. Maybe sometimes it was just a language they never learned to translate. But still, pride whispered behind closed doors doesn't fix what happens when love stays locked in the drawer with the good silverware, only brought out when guests are watching. It doesn't explain the birthdays missed, the conversations skipped, the feeling of being tolerated instead of loved. So yeah, maybe they said nice things when I wasn't around. But they never said them to me. The next morning was bright in that unforgiving way winter mornings always are in this town, light bouncing off frost-covered rooftops and sneaking through the curtains like it had something to prove, like it wanted to make sure you didn't miss a single uncomfortable detail of the day ahead. I was up before either of them, not because I couldn't sleep, though that was true too, but because I needed a few minutes of stillness in this house before the weight of unspoken things started pressing against the walls again. There was something about the quiet hum of a half-working heater and the slow drip of an ancient kitchen faucet that made everything feel more honest somehow, more raw and stripped of all the performances we dressed ourselves in the night before. I poured myself a cup of burnt coffee from the old machine they'd probably had since the 90s, the one that wheezed like a dying lung every time it tried to do its job, and I stood there in my socks, looking out the back window at the yard where Ryan once broke his wrist trying to jump off the shed with a beach towel as a cape. I remember Dad laughing from the porch, not rushing over, not worried, just laughing like it was all part of some boyhood rite of passage, and when I ran over to help, Mom told me to let Ryan learn the hard way. That was their favorite phrase, learn the hard way. Funny how they only ever applied it to me when I tried to make sense of why I always felt like a supporting actor in my own home. They came into the kitchen one at a time. Dad first, scratching his stomach through his old flannel robe, eyes half closed, grumbling something about needing more coffee filters. Then Mom, wearing a worn-out sweater and acting like she didn't see the envelope still sitting on the kitchen counter, right where I'd left it the night before. Neither of them mentioned it. Not a word. They moved around it like it was a vase of flowers that didn't belong to anyone, like it wasn't a goddamn landmine waiting to go off with one wrong glance. It wasn't even avoidance anymore. It was denial. That special brand of family dysfunction where pretending nothing happened is easier than admitting something did, where silence isn't just comfortable, it's policy. I waited for one of them to bring it up. I waited while the toast burned and the smell of singed bread filled the kitchen. I waited while Mom asked if I wanted eggs and Dad opened the paper like he hadn't just learned his son owned the roof over his head. I waited. And then I didn't. I sat down at the table, looked at both of them, and asked the question that had been sitting in my throat since I was 12 years old and cleaning up after yet another argument I wasn't invited to join, but always had to mop up after. Do either of you even care why I did it? They both froze, not dramatically, just enough that you noticed the air shift. Mom kept buttering the toast like her hands didn't know how to stop moving, and Dad turned one page in the paper and didn't read a single word of it. Because I didn't do it to prove anything, I continued, voice calm, low, like I was explaining something to someone who hadn't been listening for decades. I didn't do it to get a thank you, or to make you feel small, or to hold it over your heads. I did it because the bank was going to take this house, and I couldn't stand the idea of watching the place I grew up in get swallowed whole while you two pretended everything was fine. Still, nothing. Not even a flicker. I've been gone for 20 years, I said, finally pushing back from the table just enough to feel the distance. And you didn't even notice. That got them. Not fully, but enough. Mom looked up, and for a split second, I saw something in her face that resembled pain. Not guilt. Not regret. Just that quiet, stunned confusion people get when they realize a story they've been telling themselves might not be true anymore. Dad cleared his throat, opened his mouth, and then closed it again, like whatever he wanted to say got caught on the barbed wire between pride and shame. I didn't leave because I didn't care, I said, Standing now, cup of coffee cooling in my hand, I left because I couldn't keep being the only one who did. And with that, I walked out. Not with drama. Not with some big slam of the door or a suitcase dragging behind me like a scene from a movie. I just left. Stepped out into the morning light and felt the cold hit my face like a clean slap. Honest and sharp. The kind of cold that wakes you up and tells you you're still here, still standing, still capable of walking away from things that refuse to change. No one chased me. No one called my name. I didn't expect them to. Because in this family, no one apologizes. No one admits. No one looks back. We just pretend. And pretend. And pretend. I stood across the street from the house that raised me, or tried to anyway. The house with peeling shutters and a cracked walkway. The house where the front door always stuck in the summer and creaked in the winter. The house that carried every fight, every quiet dinner. Every Sunday that felt more like a performance than a tradition. I held the deed in my hand, heavy not with paper but with meaning, with memory, with that strange feeling you get when you realize you finally have all the power you used to beg for, and you're not sure you want it anymore. The morning air had that sharp bite of early February, the kind that settles in your lungs and makes your eyes water even if you're not crying, and I watched the curtains shift slightly in the living room window. Probably Mom peeking out like she always did when someone was parked out front too long. Maybe she saw me. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was hoping I'd come back inside. Maybe she was hoping I wouldn't. The truth is, I didn't know what either of them wanted from me anymore, and I wasn't sure it mattered. I thought about burning the deed. Right there in the street. Pulling out a lighter, watching the edges curl and blacken until nothing was left but ash and the smell of something old finally dying. There was a poetry to that. Sure, something final, something symbolic, a gesture that said you don't own me anymore and I don't want to own you either. But then what? They'd never know what it meant. They'd just see the smoke and pretend it was someone else's fire. That's how it always worked in our house. The problem wasn't real unless someone else confirmed it. I thought about eviction. Really thought about it. The power of it. The sheer, undeniable message of serving papers and watching Dad's pride crumble in the driveway, Mom's voice crack as she asked me why I was doing this. But the thought didn't bring satisfaction, it brought nausea. Because I wasn't them. I wasn't built for that kind of revenge, and no amount of childhood wounds could turn me into the kind of man who finds peace in punishment. Then I thought about doing nothing. Letting it sit in a drawer. Letting the silence grow until the deed yellowed at the corners and the ink faded, and I forgot which safe I'd hidden it in. That's what they would do. That's what they had always done, let things rot under the surface until no one could tell where the damage began. But I wasn't them. I sat back in my rental car, the deed resting across my knees like some kind of verdict, and I thought about what Lynn had said, about my mom crying after fireworks and my dad bragging to the butcher like he knew who I was. I thought about all the times I'd waited for them to say something real and how it never came, and how maybe it never would. And I asked myself, what would you do, Ethan? Not the son. Not the child. Not the version of yourself they tried to shape. But you, the man. The one who left and built something and still came back even when he knew better. And you know what's wild? After all that, I still don't know if I did the right thing, but I did what felt honest. That was more than they ever gave me. It wasn't closure. It wasn't clean. It didn't come with a ribbon or a cinematic swell of music in the background. It just was. Like most real things are, messy, quiet, unresolved. I drove to the post office. Walked in. Stood in line behind a woman mailing a birthday card and a man arguing over the price of flat-rate boxes. When it was my turn, I placed the envelope on the counter, same one from dinner, still a little smudged from fingerprints and history, and told the clerk I wanted to send it back to the house, standard mail. No rush. No return address. No note. Just the deed. Unchanged. Because maybe they'll get the message. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll open it and feel shame or confusion or something that finally forces them to look at the boy they raised and see the man he became. Or maybe they'll just file it away and forget. But if they call, I don't know if I'll answer.